The Omnivore's Deception: What We Get Wrong About Meat, Animals and Ourselves, by John Sanbonmatsu, New York University Press, New York. For my son, Emmanuel, always. When a man suspects any wrong, it sometimes happens that if he be already involved in the matter, he insensibly strives to cover up his suspicions even from himself. And much this way it was with me. I said nothing and tried to think of nothing. Herman Melville, Moby Dick. Introduction. I tried vegetarianism once, not for the animals, for the environment. I've lost count of the number of times I've heard someone say this over the years. The speaker is always anxious not to be misunderstood. While reducing or eliminating meat from one's diet to save the planet is seen as admirable, to do so to keep animals from being killed is to mark oneself out as an eccentric or moral scold. Society views as a fool or a sentimentalist anyone who would care so much about animals, particularly those we raise for food, as to wish to spare them the inconvenience of a violent death. Indeed, to exhibit exaggerated concern for mere animals when there are more important problems facing us, from global warming and war to racism and economic inequality, strikes many people not only as irrational but offensive, even an insult to our dignity as human beings. Nothing, surely, could be less important than the question of animals and meat. But what if we were wrong? Wrong not only about animals and meat, but wrong too about the meaning and purposes of a human life. What if the question of our treatment of animals was not only not trivial, but the most important issue of our time? I argue in this work that exploiting and killing other beings for human purposes is morally indefensible, and that we should abolish the meat, egg, dairy and fishing industries. However, this book is no more about veganism per se than Rosemary's Baby is a movie about becoming a first-time mum. Rather, it is about civilizational error, about what happens when we organise our society, economy and daily lives around a radical evil, then engage in self-deception to keep the truth of that evil from ourselves. The Omnivore's Deception, as I call it in this book, is the idea that we can go on raising and killing other animals for food without harming animals, wrecking the planet's ecology, or ruining our souls. But, I argue, we can't. Like everyone else around me, I grew up eating meat. Meat was not just another commodity, it was a part of my identity. The roast turkey my mother spent hours basting in the oven seemed to anchor the Thanksgiving holiday, and the smell of steaks and burgers cooking on my father's backyard grill was no more incidental to my boyhood experience of summer than the smell of chlorinated swimming pools or the sound of crickets at night. Meat was in the air we breathed, and it was everywhere else too, in the movies and on TV, in restaurants and at school. In the homeroom, we pledged our allegiance to the American flag and to the colourful wall poster from the Department of Agriculture depicting the basic 4 food groups. Milk, meat, vegetables/fruits, and cereals/breads were categories seemingly provided by nature herself, as eternal and immutable as the 4 seasons. In theory, every food group was important, but we all knew better. Though a close reading of the poster revealed beans and other legumes in the meat column, no meal was to be considered complete without the flesh of some animal. Eating our vegetables was the price of admission to the main attraction, some part of a once-living animal's body. For a long time, just where the meat on my plate came from remained a mystery to me. At 4 or 5, when I asked my grandmother where hamburgers came from, she said they grew on trees, and then hurriedly changed the subject. Even after I'd learned where meat came from, it no more occurred to me to question our eating of other animals than to question the rising or setting of the sun each day. Eating meat was no more a choice than putting on clothes in the morning. It was just something we did. And, seemingly, have always done. Our species has been eating other animals since we diverged from our fellow hominins 300,000 years ago, first as scavengers, then as hunter-gatherers. Since then, we've been nothing if not ecumenical in our omnicidal appetites, killing and eating every creature within our reach, from woolly mammoths and wild pigs to pigeons, turtles and swans. Humans eat iguanas and rabbits, octopuses, ostriches, horses and kangaroos, chimpanzees and monkeys, whales and sharks, grasshoppers and ants. 80% of humans today eat insects as part of their diet. In Amazonia, we roast tarantulas alive in a fire. In North America, we eat mostly chickens, pigs and cows, but also ducks, geese, turkeys, deer, bison, dozens of species of fish, crustaceans, amphibians, and reptiles. In Korea and China, we eat millions of cats and dogs. The latter are beaten or strangled to death or boiled alive. The very longevity and ubiquity of our killing of other beings for food has long stood as the greatest proof of its moral rightness. Nothing indeed more quickly settles the dispute between the vegetarian and the meat-eater than the latter's assertion of self-evident fact and the supposed naturalness of our domination of other animals. The first zoological taxonomy we learn as infants is that of the farm. While still in our cribs, we learn that chickens cluck and cows moo and sheep baa. By 4, we know that gorillas belong in the jungle and lions on the African savanna, while the natural habitat of pigs, horses, sheep, oxen, chickens, goats, and cows is the barnyard and pasture behind fencing and barbed wire. Species that evolved over millions of years in different parts of the world, chickens in the jungles of Southeast Asia, cows in Africa and India, turkeys in Mexico, are depicted in children's books and nursery rhymes as belonging to the same natural order, as though Linnaeus had placed farm animals right alongside kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Thus do we come to accept the idea that exploiting other beings for their ova, milk, fur, skin, labour, and flesh is the proper order of things. In the tautology of the meat system, we eat animals because we're entitled to do so, and we're entitled to eat them because we do eat them. Many animals thrive without killing or eating other beings. Herbivorous species like horses, elephants, kangaroos, rhinoceroses, llamas, gorillas, and tortoises. But other animals, of course, prey upon others, and it's those species we choose to identify with. In our minds, we're just another predator, meant to exploit and eat other species. When we kill other animals, therefore, we're merely expressing our inner natures. It follows that to reject animal agriculture, hunting, and fishing is, in a sense, to reject one's own humanness. Hence the exasperation with which the meat-eater greets the complaints of vegans that, quote, Hezbollah-like splinter faction of vegetarians, end quote, as celebrity chef Anthony Bourdain once described them, latter-day Puritans who seek to impose their abstemious, joyless lifestyles on an innocent and unsuspecting, or these days suspecting, public. In calling for an end to animal agriculture, vegans are guilty of a kind of metaphysical category mistake. In misconstruing the reality of nature, that is, they misconstrue the nature of reality too. As Michael Pollan, the nation's foremost apologist for animal agriculture, claims, animal advocates who describe domestication as a form of slavery or even exploitation are betraying a deep ignorance about the workings of nature and are engaged in a quarrel with nature itself. If there's any case to be made for our vast cruelties to animals, however, it won't be found in arguments for nature. Animal agriculture, hunting, and fishing are not enduring metaphysical truths, but cultural practices. Breeding animals in the billions, raising them in confinement, and slaughtering them is no more or less natural than paying taxes, streaming Netflix, or burning witches at the stake. If we but chose to, we could shut down the slaughterhouses and recall our fishing fleets tomorrow. And in doing so, we would be no more acting against nature than if we decided to ban opioids or to raise the minimum wage. Even if it could be shown that our exploitation and killing of other species was natural, furthermore, that fact would tell us nothing about whether we ought to continue the practice. To argue that something is good or right on grounds that it is natural is to engage in a specious form of reasoning that philosophers call the naturalistic fallacy. Properties of good and bad, that is, are not to be found in nature. Rather, they are assertions of value that we give to things. Tooth decay, cancer, and Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes bubonic plague, are certainly natural, but that does not make them good. Some psychologists believe that aggression is natural in our species. If so, shouldn't we encourage aggression in society? If aggression is a natural trait, after all, it must therefore be good. And can one ever have too much of a good thing? A popular version of the naturalistic fallacy concerns our physiological status as omnivores. The fact that we can metabolize the flesh of animals is adduced as evidence that we A, are meant to, and therefore B, are morally permitted to. However, the fact that we can eat just about anything, including beverages made with high fructose corn syrup, tells us nothing about whether we ought to do so. Cannibalism has been practiced by any number of cultures for thousands of years, but I cannot use that fact as an excuse for killing and eating my neighbour. Unlike the lion who eats the gazelle, humans aren't obligate carnivores, which means that we have a latitude of moral action that lions do not. If lions had a choice of whether to kill, and if they furthermore engaged in moral debates over right and wrong, then we might have reasonable grounds to level moral judgments against lion communities for continuing to hunt their prey. As neither situation holds, however, the problem is moot for lions, in a way that it is not moot for us. It is for us to determine what values to live by and to provide better or worse reasons for our practices and beliefs. Omnivorism is not a license to kill, it's an invitation to improve our moral characters, to act in accordance with our better natures. While it is true that humans have been killing and eating other animals for a very long time, humans have also been killing one another for a very long time too, yet few would consider that adequate justification for homicide. Neither the mere longevity of a practice nor its widespread acceptance can be used as justification to recommend it to us morally. As the sociologist Max Weber observed on the endurance of patriarchal relations, male dominance has long rested on, quote, the belief in the inviolability of that which has existed from time out of mind, end quote. However, just because men have been dominating women for the last 10,000 years does not mean that men are entitled to do so for the next 10,000, nor are women obliged to go on accepting their social subordination forever. The very longevity of male dominance only strengthens the urgent case for ending it. Arguments that appeal to the way things are to justify the way things should be are guilty of what philosophers call the is-ought fallacy. Such arguments appeal to our existing prejudices and beliefs, making them the weapon of choice in argument for those wishing to defend an unjust status quo, but the enemy of those seeking to reform society. Nothing indeed stands more in the way of social or moral progress than the received wisdom or common sense of society and the banality of an existing order. What exists is always easier to see and thus to believe in than what merely ought to be. Some hypothetical state of affairs we can see only with our moral imaginations. During the period of modern slavery, it was difficult for people to envision a world without enslaved people or owners of slaves in it, but easy to stroll down to the London dockyards or along the harbours of Jamestown or Providence to watch the hulking slave ships being rigged for the next expeditions to Africa. In part, it was the quotidian nature of slavery, its apparent self-evidence as a thing of nature, that enabled it to persist for as long as it did in the ancient Middle East, in Africa, in Europe, in Asia. In 1842, when the British government asked the Emperor of Morocco to identify the steps that he had taken to abolish the slave trade in his territories, he replied curtly that, as slavery was something, quote, on which all sects and nations have agreed from the time of Adam, end quote, the acceptability of slavery therefore needed, quote, no more demonstration than the light of day, end quote. As the Emperor's reply suggests, an entire mode of civilizational development may be erected on corrupt foundations, yet survive and flourish for millennia, owing in part to its very ordinariness. We often condescend to past peoples and civilizations, smiling at their naive embrace of institutions and beliefs that, to us enlightened moderns, seem self-evidently immoral or corrupt. In reality, however, we are no more immune to colossal moral error than the Emperor of Morocco. Vis-à-vis our relations with other animals today, the most irrational and archaic beliefs and practices continue to be embraced as natural and right by the majority of persons, and with as much thoughtless credulity as our ancestors once held the earth to be flat or believed that demons sometimes invaded the bodies of young New England girls. In a version of a joke told by David Foster Wallace, one fish turns to another and asks, "How's the water?" The second fish asks, "What is water?" Speciesism, the controlling theme of this work, is analogous to the water in Wallace's joke. Each day we go about our business without giving a moment's thought to the medium through which we swim. It's just there, like the air we breathe, and being there, it's thought to be nowhere. The fact that you have likely never heard the term speciesism before is only evidence of its total nature as the defining feature of our existence. The philosopher Peter Singer has described speciesism as an irrational prejudice or attitude of bias against other animals. However, speciesism isn't merely a prejudice. It's a way of organising our identity as human beings. Human supremacism, as we might also call it, sets the boundaries of our cultural institutions, modes of economic development, and moral and spiritual beliefs. Few people have any idea of the true scale of our systems for killing animals, but we have effectively transformed the entirety of the earth into our gulag and killing floor. Humans kill over 80 billion land animals and nearly 3 trillion marine animals every year. To effect this slaughter, we've extended over the surface of the globe a vast network of controls for breeding, surveilling, and exterminating our fellow creatures. Half the land's surface is now dedicated to agriculture, and 80% of that is devoted either to rearing animals for slaughter or to growing monocrops to feed them. That makes the animal agriculture system the most extensive artifact ever built by Homo sapiens, dwarfing even our roadways and cities. The majority of the Earth's vertebrates have meanwhile become our captives. Measured in biomass, only 4% of mammals, excluding humans, now live freely in nature, with the rest in confinement awaiting human slaughter. 70% of all birds, too, are our prisoners, living out wretched, abbreviated lives in the poultry industry. Nature, as it existed for countless millions of years, as a boundless realm in which sensuous beings dwelled in mutual interdependence with one another, facing hardship and predation, yes, but also joy, connection, and pleasure, all within a realm of freedom, has ceased to exist. Each day, millions of fishing vessels, aided by sonar and satellite data, set out on search and destroy missions, scouring the ocean of what little remains of its conscious life. Only 3% of marine animals are thought to be free from fishing pressures. 9 out of 10 commercially exploited fish have vanished in just the last few decades in a slaughter so indiscriminate that researchers at the Fisheries Centre of the University in British Columbia have compared it to wars of extermination. The collateral damage from these wars is responsible for much of the morbidity. Every pound of netted wild shrimp, for example, results in 5 to 10 pounds or more of dead bycatch. Sharks, mantas, crabs, seals, turtles, dolphins, and other species who happen to be in the way of the trawler. Scientists estimate that humans are killing 100 million sharks per year, pushing many species to the brink of extinction. Since I was in middle school in the 1970s, more than 2/3 of all sharks and rays have been wiped out. For the individual beings caught up within this juggernaut of destruction on land and at sea, suffering and trauma are the norm. Fish hauled out of the oceanic depths suffer the bends just as divers do when they surface too quickly. Rapid decompression causes their swim bladders to explode, their eyes to be pushed from their sockets, and their stomachs to come out of their mouths. Baby pigs who fail to grow fast enough for farmers turn fall behinds, are grabbed by their hind legs and repeatedly dashed against the concrete floor to smash their heads in. To induce chickens to produce more eggs before slaughter, farmers shock the birds by depriving them of food, water, and light. Billions of unwanted male chicks are sorted by low-wage workers onto conveyor belts to be ground up alive or thrown into dumpsters to suffocate or die from dehydration. Improperly stunned cows in the United States are often dismembered and skinned alive while fully conscious, etc. These, however, are but a few of the thousands of cruel practices that we inflict on other sensitive beings as a matter of routine, forms of violence so extreme that were they enacted on humans, we would describe them as atrocities or crimes of war. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this mass violence is how unremarkable it is taken to be. Its very banality serving to confirm its imagined lack of moral or existential significance. The belief that human life alone has inestimable value and that the lives of other beings have no value apart from their utility for us a vestige of a time when humans bought and sold one another as slaves and believed in divination by dreams, remains among the most enduring and closely guarded of our collective intuitions, a view as likely to be shared by the atheist as the religious fundamentalist, the university scientist as the village shaman. Whether one animal dies at our hands or 100 million is seen to make no difference. The lives of the other animals are as weightless and inconsequential as air. In 2020, when minks in Denmark's fur industry became infected with COVID-19, the government ordered the killing of 17 million of the animals. Though minks are as intelligent, sociable, and emotionally sensitive as our own cats and dogs, they were put into gas chambers. Minks are aquatic animals who can hold their breath for long periods of time. Many of the animals therefore survived the first gassing, struggling, and suffocating, only to be gassed a second time. Animal welfare organisations objected only to the unnecessary suffering of the animals, not to the fact that they were being killed in the millions. The killing of animals for food and other commercial purposes is not merely tolerated by society, but held to be the best, most ethical way to live a human life. Farmers, fishers, and others who make a living by exploiting animals are celebrated in our culture. Those who, on the contrary, decry our cruelties toward animals or who merely refrain from eating them are meanwhile treated with the sort of contempt reserved for pacifists in times of war. Few groups in society are as universally disliked as ethical vegetarians, vegans, and advocates of animal rights. One study indeed found that of all reviled groups in society, only drug addicts were evaluated more negatively than vegetarians. Libertarians denounce animal rights as a threat to free enterprise and individual liberty. Marxists dismiss veganism as bourgeois. To walk away from the animal system is even seen as a betrayal of the human race. As the narrator of Chuck Palahniuk's satirical novel Lullaby remarks of an unkempt, self-righteous vegan environmentalist named Oyster, quote, "I say he's a traitor to the species," end quote. Even to hint that there might be a better way to live a human life than causing terror and death to billions of our fellow creatures is to reveal oneself to be a kind of idiot. In the vegetarian myth, author Leah Keith depicts vegans as literally brain-damaged, unable to form complete sentences owing to the supposed protein deficit in their diets. As I myself have been a vegan for 30 years, you may want to be on the lookout for signs of my cognitive impairment. Paranoia that vegans might pose an apocalyptic threat to humanity is meanwhile a recurring theme in science fiction, with novels like Palahniuk's Lullaby and Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy depicting vegan madmen who conspire to end civilization. In her book Animal Vegetable Miracle, acclaimed writer Barbara Kingsolver engages in speculative fiction to blame vegans even for the imagined non-existence of the human race. To envision a vegan version of civilization, Kingsolver writes, start by erasing from all time the Three Little Pigs, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Charlotte's Web, The Golden Calf, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Next, erase civilization, brought to you by the people who learned to domesticate animals. Finally, rewrite our evolutionary history, since Homo sapiens became the species we are by means of regular binges of carnivory. If the existence of Tess of the D'Urbervilles justifies the past torment and slaughter of billions of animals then, however, by the same logic, Huckleberry Finn and the sublime architecture of Monticello must presumably justify the miseries of the Atlantic slave trade. But arguments of this kind, which seek to defend an unjust system or way of life on grounds that it nonetheless yielded good results, are intellectually dishonest and morally abhorrent. Notably, apologists for the meat economy credit our killing and eating of animals only with the achievements of civilization, but never with its failures. But our domination of other species has not been the unalloyed good that it is often made out to be. Pastoralism led to warfare in the Middle East and Asia, while animal domestication is thought to have served as the inspiration and model for ancient slavery. Furthermore, most of the deadly diseases ever to have plagued our species, including smallpox, cholera, diphtheria, influenza, measles, tuberculosis, AIDS, and Ebola, arose from our exploitation of animals for food. While most people feel strongly that hurting animals is wrong, most also feel just as strongly that killing and eating them isn't. This cognitive dissonance can make meat eaters uncomfortable around vegans at dinner time. Research suggests that meat eaters see veganism as a threat to their moral self-image and sense of group identity. However, fear of being judged isn't the whole story. Contempt for vegans and animal advocates stems chiefly from the contempt in which we hold other animals themselves. The figure of the animal is a universal symbol of debasement in human culture, an ecumenical term of abuse as likely to be held by the left as the right. These aren't people, these are animals, President Trump declared of undocumented immigrants in 2018, even as his critics were parading a giant inflatable Trump rat through American cities. After the Bolivian government massacred anti-government protesters at a gas plant in 2019, activists accused the country's leader of killing us like dogs. The next year, Black Lives Matter protesters accused the police of treating them like animals, prompting the New York City Police Union to accuse BLM protesters, in turn, of treating the police like animals too. Misogynists have long insulted women by comparing them to cows, pigs, cats, and other species. Feminists have meanwhile described sexual predators like Harvey Weinstein as pigs. Hence the Gaelic version of the #MeToo movement, #BalanceTonPork, or #OutYourPig. Such usages are so ubiquitous that it is hard to imagine how humans might continue to animate their extraordinary hatred of one another without the category of the animal to serve as a universal currency of denigration. To call someone an animal is to imply that they are unworthy of respect, even unworthy of life itself. Hence the enduring use of animal metaphors as expressions of racial animus, and even as cultural preparation for genocide. As Sil Ko observes, the human-animal divide is indeed the ideological bedrock underlying the framework of racism, with the figure of the animal serving as the anchor of this system. Yet, speciesism is foundational to our identity in ways that defy even the obstinate fixtures of race and gender. As Sigmund Freud observed a century ago, quote, "In the course of his development towards culture, man acquired a dominating position over his fellow creatures in the animal kingdom. Not content with this supremacy, however, he began to place a gulf between his nature and theirs. He denied the possession of reason to them, and to himself he attributed an immortal soul, and made claims to a divine descent which permitted him to annihilate the bond of community between him and the animal kingdom." End quote. Freud penned these words at a time when humans were busy slaughtering one another in the millions on the killing fields of Europe. Initially, Freud had greeted the outbreak of the First World War with patriotic fervour, but by 1915 he had become disillusioned by the war and was struggling to make sense of the instinctual needs and societal dispositions that had given rise to it. In A Difficulty in the Path of Psychoanalysis, Freud now sees our discomfort with other animals as rooted in our discomfort with our own animality. This human narcissism, as he terms it, which leads us to view other sensitive beings as worthless biological inferiors, is a source of our aggression towards one another. As children, we see no difference between our own natures and those of other animals, but by the time we have been socialized into adults, we have become so far estranged from animals as to use their names in vilification of human beings. Whether we are entitled to this contempt, however, is another question. In The Descent of Man, 1871, Charles Darwin denied that Homo sapiens was qualitatively superior to other species. The difference between our minds and theirs, he held, is one of degree and not of kind, with many other species too exhibiting high mental powers such as the formation of general concepts, self-consciousness, etc. Even senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, imitation, reason, etc., of which man boasts, are also found in an incipient or even sometimes in a well-developed condition in other animals. More than a century of scientific research has since overwhelmingly confirmed Darwin's view. Complex consciousness, far from being an unusual or isolated phenomenon, turns out to be common across the animal kingdom, found not just in apes or mammals, but in avians, fish, reptiles, and invertebrates. Other animals exhibit psychologies and emotions similar to our own, and they are as vulnerable to trauma as we are. Virtually every significant cognitive capacity once thought to be unique to our own species has also been found in others. Tool use has been observed in New Caledonian crows, octopuses, and even insects. Chimpanzees outperform college professors on short-term memory tests. Elephants and ravens conduct funerary rites for their fallen comrades. Cetaceans share traditions from generation to generation, the hallmark of culture. Pigeons are superior to humans in some measures of spatial reasoning and can be taught to distinguish between the impressionist styles of Monet and Manet. Fish have feelings and learn from one another. Bees understand the concept of zero and dream at night. Every species has its own excellence, and ours is the ability to abstract from immediate context using language, a skill that enables us to build technologies and forms of life that other species cannot. Only humans thus have Anna Karenina and astrophysics. However, we possess no neurological or morphological structure that would separate us clearly from other animals. Furthermore, we have more in common with other animals than we believe or choose to admit. Despite our many proven commonalities with other animals, however, we still behave as though we were living in a pre-Darwinian epoch, seeing ourselves as closer to the divine, or to some idealized conception of ourselves, the thinking machine is but the latest iteration, than to merely the bestial. As a consequence, what few laws that exist to protect animals are meaningless. Animals are everywhere, defined legally as property rather than as autonomous beings with a right to their own lives or bodily integrity. Under our laws, to enter the world as a non-human is to be born unworthy of life. Many people profess to love animals, and many genuinely do. An estimated 2/3 of American households keep at least one non-human companion, a fact that speaks to our desire to feel emotionally connected to other beings. However, our love for animals is partial. Americans keep about 150 million cats, dogs, birds, and horses as companions, yet each year kill and consume hundreds of times as many chickens, pigs, goats, cows, sheep, turkeys, fishes, and others. While we spend nearly $75 billion each year feeding, entertaining, and providing medical care for our companions, we spend at least twice as much to inflict violent trauma on billions of other animals. We thus love animals one moment, slaughter them the next, and fail to notice any discrepancy between the two modes of address. The same newspaper prints a heartwarming story about an animal rescuer or vegan chef one day, then about a cattle rancher or celebrity butcher the next. At the local hardware store, the bird feeders and bird seed can be found in the same aisle as the mouse traps and rat poison, just down from the cat toys and dog chews. Roberto is a meat eater, his wife Michelle is a vegan. Paula likes volunteering at our local animal shelter. Her husband likes shooting deer, then cutting their heads off and mounting them in his den. Often the same person will exhibit opposite attitudes towards animals at once, like the hunter who grieves the loss of his dog from cancer, or the bird lover who donates to the Audubon Society, yet who dines on the bodies of chickens, turkeys, and ducks. The contradiction between these two ways of living a human life, one lived in communion and love with animals, the other in violent contempt of their very lives, runs like an unmapped seismic fault beneath society, tracing the boundary of two irreconcilable value structures and modes of life. One might think that such blatantly contradictory attitudes and behaviours would provoke public debate or personal soul-searching, but the opposite is true. Since everything is permitted in our treatment of other beings, every kindness and every barbaric horror, our behaviour towards animals is seen to be a matter of aesthetics or personal taste, not ethics. The case for respecting animals' lives and caring for animals is held to be no stronger than the case for subjecting them to trauma and death, and society makes no attempt to reconcile the two. Like waves of equal amplitude travelling in opposite phases, our contradictory attitudes and behaviours towards animals are thought to cancel each other out. What is peculiar about this way of thinking about animals is that in no other domain of moral life would we accept such obvious contradictions in our values and behaviour. No one would say that child abuse is the same thing as good parenting, or that throwing an elderly person down a flight of stairs is neither better nor worse than helping them across the street. Yet, vis-a-vis other animals, one set of practices is held to be as good as another. To render these contradictory behaviours opaque to itself, society then resorts to Orwellian language, equating the enslaving of animals with freeing them, killing them with caring for them. Only in challenging these conceptual soporifics, I argue, can we hope to awaken from our deep moral slumber. While I say a great deal about ethics in this work, however, I have not sought to provide a comprehensive account of the many moral theories that bear on the question of animal rights. By way of explanation, I would offer an analogy to climate change. The reason global warming gets worse and worse each year is not because we lack excellent scientific models or theories about the impact of carbon gases on the atmosphere, but because powerful economic interests and entrenched cultural behaviours thwart meaningful change. By the same token, robust, principled arguments against our killing of other animals for food have existed for nearly 3,000 years, yet our treatment of animals today is worse than ever. Evidently then, whatever else might be at the root of our systemic cruelties against other beings, it's unlikely to be a dearth of sound moral theories. For this reason, I've chosen to focus less on philosophical theory than on the myths and forms of self-deceit that maintain us in our violent dominion, particularly the myth of the enlightened omnivore, popularised by Michael Pollan and others. A warning in advance. I have dispensed in this work with the euphemism and obliquity that other writers often use in addressing the violent nature of our relations with our fellow beings. This is not a book meant to console. Much of what I have to say will make you uncomfortable, and some of my claims will seem extreme. But difficult truths can make us uncomfortable, and the system I describe is itself extreme. That said, this is not a book without hope. As the ecology of our planet collapses, chiefly as a consequence of the animal economy, we face a choice between two different ways of relating to our fellow beings. The first, the one we know already, is based in ancient patterns of domination and violence. The second, as yet untried, would seek a deeper communion with animals through relations of compassion, respect, and love. These two paths represent incompatible modes of life, even two different ways of being human, and we must choose between them.